Bem, muito boa tarde. Vou primeiro dizer algumas palavras breves em português. É uma enorme honra para o Centro de História da Sociedade e da Cultura e para o Seminário de Histórias do Presente em receber o professor Martin Thomas, alguém que há muitos anos nos ensina a pensar melhor sobre muitos fenómenos fundamentais do século XX. Mencionarei apenas o tópico da sessão de hoje, uma abordagem global, comparativa, riquíssima do ponto de vista da investigação empírica, mas também da problematização a vários níveis da descolonização global, do momento da descolonização global. Ele está cá devido a uma imensa generosidade da sua parte, está muito contente por estar aqui connosco e julgo que a vários níveis todos nós poderemos tirar muitas ideias interessantes para discutir na nossa investigação, mas também para refletir coletivamente sobre um passado relativamente recente que continua a marcar e muito as sociedades contemporâneas. I will now move into English just to offer you a brief presentation of Professor Martin Thomas. As many of us know, Professor Martin Thomas is one of the most important experts in the last decades about important historical phenomena such as decolonization. With him, his work, we learned a lot on how to think better in a more comparative and global way about the decolonization moment, but also about late colonialism, about many different dimensions of this particular phenomenon, from cultural and ideological issues to issues connected to the securitization of late colonialism, insurgency, counterinsurgency, and also, for instance, something that's sometimes forgotten by some of us, is wonderful work on the connections between violence and labor and the colonial order in a book published some years ago. I can't recall exactly the date right now, but it doesn't matter. It is a great pleasure for us to welcome him here in Coimbra, and we must thank you for your generosity. For all of those who know you, generosity is for sure one of the first words that comes to mind, among many others, and many compliments that I could now offer you, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of people have already done it, and I prefer to do them personally. Anyway, thank you so much, Martin, for being here. It's a great pleasure. One last note to tell you, I think that some of us might know it, that this is part of an ongoing project that is going to come to fruition in March next year, in a book that will, I'm pretty sure, change the ways in which we think about decolonization, with a lot of relevant fundamental challenges that it will for sure offer to each one of us doing research on the topic, but also just plain interest, having a plain interest in decolonization. Martin, 40 to 45 minutes of talk. We'll have time for debate, and once again, for many reasons, some of them I cannot express here. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody online. It's such a pleasure to be here, and such a pleasure to see Miguel, Jose, Hugo, I've met today, all these wonderful colleagues at the University of Coimbra and Portugal more generally. It's a real pleasure to be here and a privilege too. Thank you for inviting me. I'm obviously going to be speaking in English. I will try to be as clear as I can. I have quite a strong West Country accent. I'm from the deep south of England, Cornwall. So my apologies if you hear some strange English in the next 45 minutes. It's not your understanding of English, it's my terrible accent. But yes, I'm going to talk about a world remade by decolonization, and there is a question mark at the end of that sentence, because as we all know, empires until really relatively recently were everywhere. Now, ostensibly at least, they aren't. Is that assertion valid? Does it make sense? Is it verifiable in any way? If so, how? And more basically, I suppose, if that assertion that empires are no longer with us if that is in some ways authentically true, why? Well, let's try and explain that. I'm going to start by asking how I move my PowerPoint forward. It seems to be stuck. It doesn't really make a great deal of difference.
Here, okay.
My apologies. So this is my theme. Is the world remade by decolonization? That's the issue I will be debating with you over the next hour and a half. And I'll start with this poster. Apologies to the German speakers among you, but my understanding, my translation of that piece of Weimar Republic propaganda is that, broadly speaking, that is saying, what would be left of the Entente if they got serious about their own people's right to self-determination and let go of the reins? In other words, why is the world not decolonizing in the way that the world has forced Germany to do? The answer to that, I would suggest, is that in part, at least, for most of those affected by it, opposing empire was always more visceral than ideological. The constraint of rights and opportunities was part of something bigger, the restriction of freedoms. But what freedoms? To move, to associate, to own certain things, to love certain people, to practice one's culture. Those limitations were, and unfortunately are, what makes colonialism possible. More a pervasive social condition than an exact political relationship, the colonialism of empire describes not just the maintenance of unequal political relations between a controlling imperial power and a dependent society, but more meaningfully, I think, the socio-economic hierarchies, the cultural discriminations, and the racial inequalities that such relations entail. Understood that way, imperialism lingers on. So much so that searching out colonialism's imprint seems pretty easy. Empires may no longer dominate global politics, but multiple colonial legacies endure. Some are so invidious that they cry out for our attention. Inequalities of global wealth, uneven access to the resources essential to human security, and the persistence of societal racisms. Elsewhere, empire's impact is more oblique, but it remains imminent even so. From the use of land and the extraction of resources to borders and administrative structures, languages and patterns of global commerce, and the social and cultural identifications that people make, our contemporary world is totally shaped by recent imperial history. Well, that's the marketing pitch for my career, if you like, what we've all been doing. But of course, that's also where decolonization comes in. It stands alongside the 20th century's world wars, the Cold War, and the longer arc of globalization as one of the four great determinants of geopolitical change in living memory. Well, if decolonization was one globally connected process, then surely, and this is the first sort of analytical position I'm taking, surely we cannot understand decolonization's global impact by simply examining individual empires or single colonial histories. There's a propaganda poster that I'm sure is very familiar to a lot of you here. Its message, of course, about Lusophone Africa, about Portuguese colonialism. But the reason I've selected that image first to look at is because that is an anti-colonial propaganda piece produced not in Portugal, not in Angola, not in Africa, but in relatively affluent Ontario, Canada.
TER vous souhaite la bienvenue à bord de
So
ce
too,
TER.
if we move on to this picture, another Lusophone-themed anti-colonial poster, again, I'm sure terribly familiar. Its iconography, absolutely classically symbolic of decolonization struggles and the feminization of popular resistance, but not produced in Portugal, not produced in Africa, not produced in Angola, but produced in North London by a group of leftist academics and students, many of them linked to the London School of Economics. Those images alone remind us, I think, that decolonization was always not only multinational and international, but intrinsically transnational. It worked as much across nations, empires, and boundaries as within them. And of course, it proceeded, some would say it succeeded, by forging new global connections that reordered relations between first world, second world, and third. And of course, there, colonialism's devastating impact on that unspoken world, the fourth world of indigenous peoples and First Nation communities, was at the time, and to some extent even now, replicated in their sublimation, their concealment within a broader third world designation. And of course, decolonization is why that three worlds construction came to be used in the first place. Usually portrayed as disintegrative, decolonization, I'm going to suggest, was anything but. Instead, it was intrinsically connected to globalization. And whether that is conceived, globalization that is, as a process of increasing global connectivity, or as competing ideological visions of how the world might be reconfigured through economic, cultural, and political exchange. The conditions and possibilities of that change, of globalization, or of rival globalizations, assured the supporters of decolonization much greater access to essential resources, to wider networks of influence, and, as we all know, to global audiences. But globalization could also hinder. Its neoliberal variant has reinforced economic inequalities and facilitated imperial forms of influence, making decolonization harder to complete. Ending empires, of course, also occasioned many of the longest conflicts of the 20th century, reminding us that it was always more than a political context. It energized different ideas of belonging and transnational connection, of sovereignty and independence, and of the struggles necessary to achieve them. Late colonial conflicts spurred other connections as the colonized weak, and I use that term in inverted commas, but as the colonized weak built transnational networks of support to overcome the military and economic advantages of strong, so say, imperial overseers. Insurgency spread. The counterinsurgencies that followed triggered rights abuses whose global exposure left empires shamed and morally disarmed. Images like that, a very early stage interrogation conducted by Britain's Malayan security service of ethnic Chinese tin workers in a squatter settlement in Peninsula Malaya, are easy to replicate in any empire across virtually any period of decolonization that we'll be looking at. So much so that, as we know, in its violence, as in its politics and economics, decolonization reshaped globalization, just as globalization conditioned decolonization. Well, all of that is simply, I suppose, to try and say that defining when and if empire ended is difficult. Integrating global factors that accelerated or slowed decolonization adds complexity. And there's not much epistemological or ontological precision to help us navigate our way through all of this. The meaning of decolonization is contested because disagreement persists about its essential qualities. The word decolonization didn't have common currency before World War II and was not even commonly used at the height of the process it describes in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Rather, decolonization was a process of several moving parts: the withdrawal of European rule, the takeover of governmental apparatus by anti-colonial nationalists, the pressure of Cold War rivalries, and the efforts by minority groups in decolonizing states to assert separate claims to nationhood. And that list could, of course, be much longer. Locating those processes historically invites global perspectives and a stress on contingency. Some colonial demands for change were articulated in a language of reform, not of revolution. So paying attention to gradualist reforms is fundamental to historicizing decolonization, not as something inexorable, not as something inevitable, but as an outcome neither anticipated nor desired by local politicians, trade unionists, and civil society actors trying to dismantle colonial discrimination through empire rather than against it. One implication of that is that anti-colonialism makes sense as a unifying abstraction, an expression of opposition to something ethically indefensible, but not as an unswerving support for a particular national form. The idea, in other words, that colony would become nation ignores the alternatives in play. Imperial and nationalist conceptions of bounded sovereignty jarred with the pluralistic arrangements and local improvisations that enabled empires to survive despite the weaknesses of their structures and the porousness of their borderlands. Transnational connections and differing layers of attachment to kin, community, and faith were everywhere different, yet always the same in exposing the myth of nationalism triumphant. Decolonization's interactions with capitalist globalization, or its antonym in socialist internationalism, also suggest that bilateral transfers of power between a single ruling authority and a dominant local movement were never total. The strands of economic connectivity, capital movement, communications links, and migratory flows integral to globalization always defied the ideological attachments of red globalism, non-alignment, or other South-South visions of a post-colonial world, tying former colonies then into new international coalitions and economic blocs. Mentioning globalization again reminds us that the substance of Western European, American, and Japanese colonialism was capitalistic. From investment capital and foreign-owned banking networks to hierarchically ordered workplaces, coercive labor practices, and the prioritization of export-oriented production, the economic life of empires reflected forms of racial capitalism that reinforced inequalities in the distribution of power and protections. Decolonization had promised to end these practices, but it generally failed to deliver as much economically and socially as it did politically or constitutionally. Sovereignty changes, in other words, were insufficient in themselves to stop capitalist globalization. Worse, anti-colonial modernizers then took up various strategies of development, infrastructure building, educational provision, cultural and linguistic renewal that were designed to make independence real, but most found they could not do so unilaterally, alone. Foreign sponsors, technocratic expertise, and loan capital created political economies of influence that jarred with these new assertions of sovereignty. So for many of those living under colonialism, as well as the writers, political activists, and others who challenged it, the violence intrinsic to imperialist practices was self-evident, but extremely difficult to end. Some describe this violence in structural terms, from the Atlantic world capitalism made possible by the slave trade, the devastation of indigenous communities in the Americas, elsewhere, to contact with conquistadors and their pathogens, to the neo-colonialism, economic dependency, and indebtedness that have blighted decolonizing nations. Colonialism has been indicted as the worst of contemporary evils. Slavery was, of course, fundamental to colonial capitalism, particularly in plantation agriculture, as insatiable as in its demand for transported labor as it was destructive of tropical environments. And that combination of human commodification and ecological degradation was sufficiently pervasive by the 19th century to be labeled by scholars a plantationist scene, devastating to communities and ecologies throughout much of the global south. Not surprisingly then, that colonialism challenged by 20th century decolonization was perhaps less blatantly rapacious, but still racially configured, socially stratified, and environmentally transformative. Think for a moment of the peace settlement to emerge from the 20th century's First World War. Colonial territories, as you know, were systematically excluded from the so-called liberal order that Europe's imperial powers tried to impose. The victors' empires left in place the administrative regulations, economic practices, and cultural discriminations that underpinned colonialism's everyday violence. New ideas of sovereignty and self-determination, meanwhile, set Europe even more apart from the wider world over which its leading state actors claimed continuing dominion. The liberal internationalism, in other words, of the interwar period, distilled the imperialist mindset to its hypocritical essence. The colonial continuities inherent in the World War I settlement also suggest that it makes little sense to analyze those interwar years that follow either as stopping points in the otherwise onward march of globalization, or as some sort of watershed separating empire growth from irreversible empire decline. The aspirations of Black radicalism would be disappointed in the short term, but other opponents of empire were closer to meeting their goals, something that, as that propaganda poster from the early 1920s again suggests, numerous, if you like, insiders to the colonial situation were worrying about more and more. By 1919, from Central Europe to Eastern Asia, internal oppositionists and external challenges stood at the threshold of bringing down empires centuries in the making. In the event, those challenges proved decisive only for the landmass empires of Eurasia, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, and the Imperial Russian, but not for the oceanic empires of Britain, France, Portugal, the United States, and the rest. African, Asian, and Caribbean anti-colonialism was held in check. World War II catalyzed deeper changes. Fighting total war encouraged bigger government as imperial states intruded deeper into the lives of metropolitan citizens and colonial subjects to demand increased effort and material. But the pressures of global war often severed links between those metropolitan populations and colonial dependencies entirely, most obviously for defeated imperial states, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The British Empire also suffered total humiliation in the first phase of war against Japan, and in this and other inter-imperial contests, the continuing violence of war tore administrative and economic fabrics apart, leaving the poorest in colonial societies even more chronically insecure. Admittedly, when disaggregated to the micro level of individual encounters, the kaleidoscope of militias, militaries, and guerrilla movements from Indonesia through Vietnam to Malaya, Burma, and elsewhere that pursued various economic interests, ethnic claims, and wider political objectives don't map neatly onto the macro level narratives of violent decolonization that we all know. But whatever their inspiration, colonial acts of group violence, plus less visible but more prevalent civilian non-compliance with occupation orders and labor requirements, undermined the claims of returning European imperial administrators that their work could still continue. World War II's colonial famines in India, in Indonesia, and Vietnam, meanwhile, registered the largest loss of civilian lives in modern colonialism, a cumulative total that ashamedly we still don't precisely know, but certainly of more than 5 million people, either starved or afflicted by epidemic illnesses, their bodies were too malnourished to resist to the point of death. Even those appalling losses did not end empire. By 1945, the architecture of Bretton Woods, with dollar supremacy at its foundation, the prioritization of European relief, and the supranationalism of the United Nations and its agencies rendered the dynamics of North-South inequality more transparent than ever. I find that United Nations sort of congratulatory poster nauseating, but maybe that's just me. Colonialist presumptions were harder for international actors, at least, to reconcile with building a new global order, whatever their attachments in the emerging Cold War. International law, which at the start of the 20th century had presupposed a racially configured world, was, after 1945, edging, slowly, but edging towards a repudiation of colonialism. Neither the UN Charter nor the wave of human rights protections of the late 1940s did so unequivocally, but they did assert a globalism that put Europe's imperial powers on the defensive. Even so, empire, as you know, was far from done. Even when civilizational claims were excised from official statements justifying empire, imperial thinking still shaped ideas about how sovereign statehood should be constituted and when independent nations should be recognized. Its traces, again, as we all know, were evident in everything from the constitutional plans of late colonial reformers to the developmental projects and human rights discourses promoted by supranational agencies and NGOs in the 1960s and much later. The decolonizing world, in other words, was still assigned a junior status within this global political geography. Its elevation to full integration dependent on foreign-led modernization, capital investment, and technology transfer. Developmental economics, much like Western immigration policies and Cold War security strategies, still rested on racial tenets that divided rich world from poor. Western Europe's imperial technocrats, US modernization theorists, and communist bloc advisors all shared similar presumptions of superior knowledge to guide former colonies to either capitalist or socialist modernity. They were challenged by local claims to rights equality and cultural respect, but these were articulated in different registers. In some regions, such as French Black Africa, civil protests, strike actions, and rights claims prefigured wider citizenship, increased representation, and reformist dialogue. In others, opposition expressed itself through violence. The late 1940s waves of Asian decolonization conflicts pitched nationalist republics in Indonesia and Vietnam, and leftist insurgents in Malaya into years of conflict. While in South Asia and Palestine, intercommunal violence and administrative breakdown prefigured territorial partition, displacement, refugee crises, and loss of life on such calamitous scale that the decolonization behind them was obscured by its human costs. Whatever the original UN Charter's inclusions and omissions, the organization's credibility in the global South always rested squarely on its rejection of colonialism and an embrace of the collective right to self-determination, no matter how limited the General Assembly's power to pass enforceable resolutions to bring those objectives about. On the matter of inalienable human individual rights, the voices of anti-colonialists outside the UN and the tone of sympathetic General Assembly delegations inside it were more dissonant. Trade unionists and lawyers representing what we now describe as political prisoners, those detained in colonial prisoners, whether for peaceful oppositional activity or breaking those very basic laws of human interaction with which I began my lecture, invoked both the December 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the later European Convention on Human Rights to highlight abuses. But for other leading anti-colonial nationalists, individual rights were always secondary to collective freedom and the material benefits of enhanced social rights. Some went further still, dismissing the prioritization of the rights of the person over the needs of the group as a Western invention and an imperialistic one. In this strand of thinking, decolonization as an expression of inalienable rights was, first and foremost, a quest for nationhood. The broader point, though, is that decolonization politics was, in some measure, rights politics. The more difficult question to answer is rights of which type, those inhering in the individual or those owed to communities denied opportunities to express their collective aspirations. Now, obviously, the two weren't mutually exclusive. The issue was rather which was the more locally urgent before independence and which held political priority after it. Time would tell. So where do these contests over rights and completing claims to oversee improvements in living standards within late colonial societies leave us in assessing how the end of empires came about? Tempting though it might be to imagine an irresistible groundswell of popular support for decolonization, with one imperial domino after another falling before local demands for self-determination, the end of empires was more negotiable than this image implies. For one thing, colonial politics after 1945 was never reducible to a binary choice for or against national sovereignty. Often, talk of independence was closer to a whisper than to a scream. For another thing, colonialism, as I've said, was never monolithic. Sorry, anti-colonialism was never monolithic. Its ideological ingredients varied, as did the actions of its supporters. So too did debates over the means to achieve more equitable societies. Third worldist attachments and hostility to foreign economic interference typically featured, confirming that colonialism was at once locally constituted and globally connected. In some places, India for one, such discussions could be characterized as a kind of national dialogue. For the most part, though, anti-colonial activism was either an elite affair or the work of dedicated cadres operating outside the mainstream of workaday life. The notion of a unity of anti-colonial purpose and intercultural solidarity, effusively described by Richard Wright's account of the Bandung spirit, sidestepped opposing views of what the previous year's Bandung conference meant and the disagreements over how to fulfill its promise. And of course, Bandung, as you can see, was as elaborately and in some ways imperially orchestrated as more familiar imperialist conferences and summitry that preceded it. Nonetheless, Bandung solidified the image of decolonization as a moral struggle for freedom and dignity denied. In the diversity of its delegations, the range of global audiences it addressed, and the way it spoke to them, Bandung did change the style and the substance of decolonization geopolitics. After Bandung, it was impossible to make a convincing ethical case for colonial oversight. The violence of decolonization's continuing wars, meanwhile, hit colonial subjects hardest, their status as vulnerable civilians, unrecognized politically or legally. Artillery shelling, assault helicopters, long-range bombing, issues we are only too familiar with as I speak, were indiscriminate killers. But the low technology practices of infantry sweeps, village clearances, and forced removal of populations were what caused the greatest number of global deaths in decolonization violence through malnourishment, increased infant mortality, and epidemic outbreaks among the displaced. And as scholars, we are still only just getting to grips with that basic truth, I think. More than anything else, civilian victimization brought decolonization's hidden wars under global scrutiny. Deploying evidence of rights abuses lent moral authority to anti-colonial claims of legitimacy. Building foreign networks of support was vital for armed oppositionists, and sympathetic foreign governments defended these violent non-state actors in international forums. They offered them sanctuary, they offered them weapons, they offered them aid. But whether operating inside colonial territory or from sanctuary bases and through governments in exile located in friendly frontline states, insurgent movements all used transnational connection to embed alternate governance structures. And there's a poster that I know numerous colleagues use a lot of the time, and you can divert yourself by sort of searching for your favorite anti-colonialist leader amongst those groups. Recognition, in other words, by friendly regimes validated insurgency as never before. Doing politics or business with insurgent partners both reflected the transnational alignments of decolonization and made them. A willingness to sustain political dialogue alongside the promise of privileged economic access and trade deals after independence became levers used to extract strategic concessions and international recognition. All of which meant that by the 1960s, guerrilla diplomacy was a normative standard, not some contingent facet of insurgencies, but the stuff of international politics in the global south. So moving to a conclusion, where are we? In the political realm, quasi-colonial relationships subsist, with numerous island territories and other relatively small dependencies in oceanic peripheries. But big and small, many post-colonial nations have remained aligned with their former imperial rulers. Local protests since 2019 against the West and Central African CFA franc, monetary unions pegged to the euro, but established and regulated by France, rehearsed accusations of European neocolonialism and a form of continuing French colonial tax. And there are numerous other similar examples of that sort of phenomenon that I could include here. The world remade by decolonization is, though, different to the world of empires that preceded it. For one thing, numerous former dependencies across a broad Asian arc, stretching from Korea to Israel-Palestine, and including India, Pakistan, and Indonesia, have become powerful, perhaps too powerful, global actors. For others, their sovereignty remains compromised by problems of debt and dependency, instability, and foreign interventionism. Crucial here was how well the newly independent states managed what political economists term structural dependence, namely the danger for developing countries that inward investment might come with political strings attached, something that, of course, Jamaica's Michael Manley and numerous other supporters of the new international economic order of the 1970s would rail against. For supporters of globalization, the answer lay not in rejecting such foreign investment, but in embracing multiple providers. Diversifying the number and type of investors offered better protection than anything else. In this reading, a virtuous cycle might result, in which investors promoted open labor markets and democratic accountability, knowing that capital was safer in countries with good standards of governance. Of course, an extremely imperialistic value judgment. The contrary argument, popularized by dependency theorists, of course, suggested the opposite outcome, that investors tolerated coercive labor practices and authoritarian government to keep wages low, populations compliant, and profits high. Well, by focusing on paths of colonial destruction, what I've been trying to suggest is that empires have ended without implying that decolonization is anywhere near being done. The difficulty, of course, is that the unequal relations of power, characteristic of colonialism, persist in places long since formally decolonized. If the political task is to find ways to address such inequalities, the analytical challenge is to reach a judgment about whether the ostensible end of empires signified a genuine decolonization or not. For some, particularly in the field of post-colonial studies, colonialism endures in patterns of thought, speech, and behavior. And as I've suggested, scholars working in international political economy reach similar conclusions, but do so using data on exchange rates, commodity pricing, and unfair trade terms between developing countries and rich world importers. So if the socio-economic markers of 21st century colonialism may be registered in discrepancies of life expectancy, poverty, and life chances between rich world and poor, for those more interested in cultural markers, the greatest salience of colonialism lies in the casual racism of the everyday. At stake in both positions are the dominant self-images of particular nations, their professed values, and their occlusion of difficult colonial pasts. Those marginalized by ethnicity, by religious affiliation, or by income from the narratives of rich world politics underline that the unmaking of empire didn't, I think, mean the end of colonialism. And I'll stop there. Thank you.